The Pastor's Heart and Dominic Steele, and thanks for joining us. And what does a sex therapist wish senior pastors knew? My guest is Monica Cook. She's a sexologist. She's a Christian. Her website says that the common issues she talks to people about are difficulty in maintaining a healthy sex life after having children, ineffective communication around sex, mismatched libidos or low libido, sexual boredom, painful sex, pornography or sex addiction, erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, and difficulties with orgasm and arousal, understanding menstrual cycles, and challenges in how religion and faith and cultural practices intersect with sexuality. There's a lot of issues there that many people have. And Monica, can we start with the pastor's heart? And as pastors, we want to do good for our people, and yet sometimes, I think you were saying to me a couple of weeks ago, we as senior pastors or people on pastoral staff may not be doing the best thing when people come to talk to us. What do you think we get wrong?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think the first place to start is with a bit of self-compassion as well, because it is a very complex area. You're dealing with people with their core beliefs, with their value systems. They're often dealing with their own heart issues of shame, or they might have trauma and strong emotions in that space. So it's a complex area. But I think what I'd love to see is, I think when people come to see their pastors, there's a sense that the pastor feels like he has to tell them what the right thing to do is. Whether that be theologically, they think that's going to fix the problem. But in actual fact, often the person coming to see the minister or the pastor already has a sense of knowing that often, and has often even tried to change their life or try to work with whatever their issue is. But they're actually coming to the minister for a different reason, which is more of a relational one. They're wanting to step into a space that is safe, non-judgmental, and compassionate space where they can share what's going on for them. And I think that's actually the emphasis that I would love to see pastors kind of holding, like a holding container for those people that are wanting to come and talk. And I really love that passage in John chapter 8, verses 1 to 11, where Jesus is presented with this woman that's caught in adultery. And I love it because I think it beautifully frames what I think ministers should step into. The very first thing that Jesus says is, who here is free of sin, is without sin. And that is the first step, I think, for ministers, is actually to look inward into their own heart, to potential sin within their own sexuality and their own sexual journeys, so that as they're working with whoever that has approached them, there's a sense of awareness and compassion, and also prayer over their own sex life as they're working with this person. As we know, so many of our top leaders have struggled with this, and when it's exposed, it's pretty epic. So I would love to see an inward perspective as well, of looking inward at their own hearts in this space, prayer for themselves, getting other people to pray for their protection, as well as the person that they're working alongside with. And then the next thing Jesus says is, nor do I condemn her. So there's actually then a space for, how do you work with this person to let them know that they're not condemned in Christ, and walking in that journey with an awareness of where the separation is occurring. They're obviously struggling with a particular issue, and maybe they're trying to take matters into their own hands. It's not working out so well. So what is their need that God or Jesus could step into to fill that need? It might be that they're lacking in validation, or they're needing to turn to whatever they're doing as part of self-soothing. But how could God actually meet them in their need? And I think that's the role of ministers and pastors, is to understand how God can heal them in whatever they're trying to do on their own, and it's not working. And then the final thing he says, it's the very last thing he says, is go and sin no more. And I think sometimes we get it reversed. There's a real sense of like, quickly we've got to stop the sin. But actually the final part is then, once they're on the path to healing, once they're getting closer to God in their journey, and they're starting to feel his movement in their life, then it's how do we put in support structures and connect them up with accountability partners or whatever it might be, whatever the issue is that they're dealing with, to ensure that they stay on track and go and sin no more. And so I love that flow. I really feel like that's important to keep in mind for ministers as they're helping people in this space as a framework. The other thing I wanted to say is I feel like, and this is certainly the feedback I get from my clients, is that sometimes when they go and talk to a minister, their issues can sometimes be minimized because there's a sense that, well, sexuality is just a small component of your bigger relationship. Don't worry, it's only a very small section, like build other things as well. And the reason why I think that's unhelpful is because of a piece of research that just came out by a sexologist, Barry McCarthy, and his wife, Emily. And I want to read this because I think this is really powerful. It said that basically spouses attribute only 15 to 20% of their happiness to a pleasing sex life, but unhappy spouses ascribe 50 to 70% of their distress to sexual problems. So what that means, what the translated, is that when things go well, then yes, sex takes up a very small component of the relationship. But when things are not going well, it can be very distressing for a couple, and the consequences quite far-reaching within the relationship. So I think it is really important to take what people are telling you seriously if something's not going right in their sexual relationship.
So in the first part of your answer there, you took me down the line of when sexual sin was involved, but in the second part you were talking more about not so much sin in a relationship, but struggle sexually in a relationship. And so how might I muck it up in the... So I suppose it's what you're saying is the area I'm likely to muck it up when it's a struggle area rather than a sin area is by minimising. That's what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, it could be a sin as well. It could be that someone comes to you struggling with what they think is sinful, or
but something like mismatched libidos is not sexual sin.
Absolutely.
It's just the way it is at the moment.
Exactly, but it's still a struggle for them in the relationship. So taking that seriously and giving them the space to talk about that, and also letting them know that help is available. And I think that's the other element here too, is how you know where your role as minister ends and where the role of a sex therapist begins.
You said to me earlier that was a bit of a kind of a struggle point, that you felt like sometimes ministers, we're weighing into areas that are outside our expertise. And do you want to give us that?
Yeah, sure, because I think, and that's why in that what I was talking about with the adultery kind of section is very much sticking to helping them find how whatever they're engaging in is impacting on their spiritual walk. But when it comes to the other aspect, like mismatched libidos, there's also so many other things that feed into that. There's the biological, there's the psychological, there's childhood trauma, there's and because so many things feed into sexual function, you need someone that is across all of those areas that can understand how they all work together to end up in certain issues for people. So you need someone that sort of sits over all of those areas and understands how to identify what the underlying issues are, and then with enough tools and interventions to be able to then go in at the heart of whatever it is that's causing the issue and to address that. And so that's why I think it's so important to also always mention that professional help is available, because you need someone that sits in that space. The other important thing is, I guess, finding a therapist that is will respect your Christian values, if you're Christian, because what can happen is if you're working with someone that doesn't appreciate that, the very first thing they'll probably work in is in the space of how do we start to shake your core belief that it's about God's vision for your sexuality, because that's seen as being part of the problem, actually.
Right.
They'll start
in the secular thinking.
In the secular thinking. So it's going to be more of an issue of how do we start to shake what God's vision for your sexuality is, and what is your own vision for sexuality, actually? What do you want from your sex life? And it's a very subtle shift, but it's really unhelpful
teaching me to sin.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it depends on what comes out of what that person's vision for their own sexuality is, but it can be problematic then, especially if the therapist is triggered by some of the things this conservative person might be saying to them and very concerned by them. It also means that some of the interventions that might be suggested might not be aligned with their values either. So it might be, why don't you use some porn to help increase your desire and turn to fantasy, as a possible way of moving forward? Or how about you introduce a third party into this kind of system to kind of work with whatever mismatched libidos or whatever it might be. So it's about also making sure that whichever therapist you're going to see will be able to work and respect with those values of yours. So, yeah.
How did you get into this business?
That's a great question. You see, I have a real passion for science and communication. And I realised, I worked in health education for a long time, and I realised that there was one part of science communication that was just done so poorly. And there was all this research out there, but none of it was actually reaching the general public and helping them in any way. And people were going online and trying to find answers to these questions. We don't get taught about pleasure, sexual pleasure. We get taught about STIs and contraception and what not to do, but we don't really get much training and discussion in the area of how do we actually enjoy sex once we're in this safe relationship. And people were going to online sources, and then you get pornography, which is really unhelpful vision of what a healthy sexual relationship looks like. And so I really felt a real desire to step into that space and bridge the gap between what was happening, the research, and also how we use that to then encourage couples. And then with my Christian background, I realized there's even less people talking about it in the Christian circle, and such great need. So then it all kind of came together, and this is where I am. And God just kept on opening doors.
So a lot of us as pastors, we speak into couples' relationships, particularly at the beginning. When people come to us for marriage preparation. What do you want us to say that we might not be saying in that space?
The first thing I would say is be really aware of some of the myths that people will come in with that are really unhelpful and go on to have really unhelpful kind of consequences in their marriage. So there's a sense that if you've been sexually pure before marriage, that your sex life is going to be awesome on the other side, that God owes you that almost. Or a reverse, and the reverse flip side, if you've not been done what they perceived God has wanted you to do in your past, that somehow it's going to result in a dysfunctional sex life afterwards because you've sinned. And then there's also people struggling with having been told sex is bad and disgusting and gross and bad, and then suddenly flip the switch, they're having to be married, and suddenly sex is good, go for it. Couples really struggling in that space to make that switch, not just mentally, but in their body. It's a felt sense that sex is still bad.
How do you help people in that? What do you want us to say in that space?
So
what do you say in that space?
Well, the thing is, as I was saying, it's more than just knowledge. It's more than just being told sex is good and God made it for two people to enjoy, and it's healthy. It's so much more than that, because it's felt sense. It's actually in the body. And so part of my work is actually in first education. So I've got my models over here. I can show you. I usually use models and things to at least help frame and help them understand what is happening in their body. Often people have not even seen their own anatomy and understand how it works, and so it is gross because it's unknown and it's scary. So there's a kind of, and then there's a normalization of what goes on in that space, which once again we don't do much education. And then it's really identifying what is gross about it, what is exactly at the core of this, what is bad, what is gross, and trying to understand what the narrative is in their head that they're telling themselves about where that grossness is coming from. And then, like I said, because it's more than a head thing, it's actually in the body, I do a lot of somatic work around allowing yourself to feel pleasure in your body, opening yourself up to pleasure and starting where it feels safe. So that might be lying in the sun and on the beach and allowing yourself to feel what that feels like as you lie on a beach. And that's where you start. Because then once you are able to sink into that, then it opens up, your body will naturally be curious about what the next pleasure place will be. And you start to sort of rewire the brain almost into realizing the body learns that this can be pleasurable, this can actually be good experience, this is a safe experience. And so that's kind of how I work in that space, particularly it's a big issue particularly for women as well. But jumping back...
A bigger issue for women?
Well, it's interesting because it's... I think women are often a lot more kind of judgmental over their own bodies. There's a lot more judgment over how they feel, how they sit in their own body. For men, there's a lot of pressure. Performance pressure is their biggest issue. And so if they're going to come in with thinking sex is bad, 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 it's often because they feel the pressure of having to be something that they're not sure they can step into. So they come in already with anxiety around that space. So that's one myth. There's also other things that they struggle with, like sex is, now that I'm in a relationship, then I'm entitled to have sex whenever I want. Or the flip side, which is it's all about the other person's pleasure. And it's not about my own pleasure. And then they come in saying, why am I not enjoying sex? It feels like such a chore. So those things I just wanted to highlight for ministers, just to be aware of those things if they hear it in the conversations, and jump on them and help them move towards a healthier vision, which is what I'm about to say now, because I think this is so important, is setting them a healthy and realistic framework as they're going into marriage of the fact that sex is dynamic. It's always, it looks different from day to day, which means that it might be awesome one day, it might be not so good the next day, but so long as both partners are satisfied and moving towards each other in closeness, that's what matters. And I use the metaphor of a garden, which is actually quite biblical, all through the Song of Songs, a garden is used. And I think there's a reason for that. And that is that a garden is dynamic. It's always growing, it's always changing. It's dependent on the weather, so the immediate circumstances of your life, but also the season that couple might be in. It's dependent on the quality of the soil, how many weeds are growing in that garden. And I can extend the metaphor. I know we don't have time for that, but helping them to understand that, also no two gardens are the same. They're all different. And there's a lot of fumbling and exploration that needs to happen to get to know this garden. And together, you can landscape this garden too. So what is your shared vision for your gardens then? So you get to design that. The world doesn't get to tell you what it should look like or what it needs to look like. You guys get to design this garden. God gives the beautiful boundaries and framework, but there's a lot of creativity within the space of your garden, and you get to do that, which is exciting for couples, but they're so often so caught in thinking that it needs to look a particular way. So encouraging them, in that space, and also the idea that if you're in a garden, you don't have to run to all the corners of the garden for it to officially be sex. And I think that's another huge issue.
So what do you mean by that?
I'll explain it. So basically, people think that sex equals intercourse, and that all these things have to happen. You need to have the foreplay, you need to do this, you need to do this, and then you have intercourse, and that's sex. But actually, there's sex and intercourse is just one dish on the table, so to speak, of many other dishes that a couple can choose from, depending on their energy level. So in the sense that, and I think part of the problem with this is that, a lot of Christians have often engaged in all that foreplay and things before they've got to marriage, and they've identified intercourse as being the pinnacle of sex. So they've avoided that. And then when they get to marriage, they go ahead and have intercourse, they have sex. And then suddenly sex becomes all about intercourse without the rest of the foreplay and the other enjoyable stuff that they did beforehand. So sex becomes about intercourse. And that's really unhelpful too, because then it puts a lot of pressure on the relationship to always be having intercourse for it to be officially sex.
So you sent me down two thoughts there. One
Yeah.
is, I mean, what's sin and what's not sin before marriage?
Yeah.
And what are you suggesting should be on the banquet table after marriage?
Yeah. So let's take the second question. What should be on the banquet table after marriage? So many things. It's not just about intercourse. It could be about manual pleasure. It could be about kissing and touching and fondling. And you could go down, the oral route if you wanted to. There's so many different ways in which couples can engage sexually and intimately with one another that doesn't have to be all about intercourse. And because if it is all about intercourse, then it's very goal-oriented. And the minute it becomes goal-oriented, it places a lot of pressure and anxiety, which immediately cuts across desire and cuts across enjoyment, because it becomes about a performance. We have to get there for it to be officially sex. And that's what I find myself working in all the time is couples coming in having lost their enjoyment, tired, they've had kids, they've got busy jobs, and they're not having sex because they think that every time they engage in sex, it has to look like this huge thing, when in actual fact they could just lie beside each other and touch each other. And that's sex. That's, touch each other, get to arousal. And so I always encourage my couples to not be limited by a very, very small concept of what sex is, but to enjoy the variety and diversity of enjoying each other's bodies, particularly after sex. So that it's like, what do you have energy for tonight, sweetheart? I don't know, maybe level 2. You want to just have a bit of a passion kiss, and that way you're staying in touch. You're not just, it's not like it's on or it's off. But there's different levels of interaction that couples can engage in. And so, did you want me to tackle the first question?
Yeah.
So I guess the first question is, what is sin, I guess, leading up to, on the other side? And that's difficult because I, as a sexologist, I consider sex as any kind of interaction that is sexual arousal, where sexual arousal is involved. And so...
and that makes sense to me. As a person who studies the Bible, I'm just thinking about 1 Thessalonians 4.
Yeah.
And it's God's will that I not commit sexual immorality for a whole range of vertical reasons, but also the reason that I not wrong my brother, who might be her future husband. Yeah.
Yes.
So I don't want me to be sexually aroused for somebody who isn't my wife and isn't somebody else's future wife. Does that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that's, but one thing I'm sorry. What were you going to say?
Go. Yeah.
I was just going to say, if you consider sex to be a garden, a person, two people are always going to be growing towards each other in intimacy. So it's normal and natural, actually, that people are heading towards sex when they're dating, when they're together, when they're engaged. It's a completely normal evolution, actually, for these different feelings to emerge. And so I just wanted to say that because I think sometimes people feel really bad for feeling these feelings towards their partner. But they're completely normal and natural. It's what a healthy garden does, is grow towards each other. And I guess that's the element of when self-control and things are important to foster, with especially that early part of a relationship. And it's so hard for people these days because that early part can be years for couples, whereas in the Bible it wasn't that long for couples to be in that phase, of growing towards each other in relationship. They got married pretty quick. So
how can we make mistakes when people come to talk to us about past abuse?
What I think is helpful is always putting straight off the bat, putting out the fact that there is professional help there for them, from a trauma-informed therapist or a sex therapist. That is really important because there's often a lot of deeper stuff that they need to process through with someone that's qualified to do that. But that doesn't mean you can't have a role in that space. And I think
What might a sex therapist say that's different to somebody who's an expert in post-traumatic kind of areas? How might the two different professions help? I mean, you can only refer somebody to one person, really. Which one should you choose to refer to?
Sure. I think, with particularly with this question, I don't want to rule out trauma-informed therapists generally, because there are some really good ones that work particularly in the space of sexual trauma that are not sex therapists. And on the flip side, I don't want to rule out sex therapists who specialise in sexual trauma. So I think that's where the kind of two circles almost overlap. There are a group of people that have different qualifications that both specialise and do a very good job of working in that space. One is just going to have come from a psychological counselling-y background and then specialised into this sexual trauma area, and the other one will have come from sexual training and medical approach, and then also specialised more in the counselling of trauma. But I think the outcome is basically going to be the same. So I'm a bit cautious to sort of divide the two. I think it's more about who it is and knowing whether they have a good track record of working with people in this space, and that's word of mouth and trusted people that you're working alongside with, and that's the power of a multidisciplinary team. That churches have people on their list that they know they can refer on to in the community, and I think that's important as well. So. But I think for ministers working in this space, the very first thing that they're going to be probably confronted with is shame, the impact of shame. And actually shame generally will flow into nearly everyone that comes to see you in a space, whether it be from abuse or whether it be from past sexual experiences or homosexual experiences, or shame at even not having any experiences at all. They're going to bring shame into the space. So I think a bigger question for ministers is, how do we work with shame, with the clients with the people in front of us? And there's a great book, this book that I like a lot. I don't agree with everything, but this is called Sex, God and the Conservative Church by Tina Schermer Sellers.
And a subtitle, Raising Shame from Sexual Intimacy. What does she say there? So
that's I really like a framework that she uses in that book. It's called the name, frame, claim, and aim framework. And what the very first thing there is name. So being able to tell your story to somebody that is going to hold that space that I was telling you about, that safe space, for them to make meaning almost of, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to take what they've experienced in the past, help them understand and make meaning of that so that they have hope for the future. That's kind of the goal here. So part of that is them having a chance to safely process what's happened to them in the eyes of somebody that is going to sit there and empathically and compassionately hear them and not react or just listen to them and hold them and accept them. That is the first step to actually breaking shame, because shame is a fear that people are going to reject you if you show them who you are. So it goes and manifests as shame. So if you can sit there with a minister, with your partner, with a friend that you trust, and tell your story and see that it's not going to push them away, that's actually part of the healing of shame. That's the first step of healing. The next step is frame, and that's the framework, providing them a healthy framework of information in the sexual realm, whether it be about their trauma, whether it be about sexual function, if they haven't done a lot of reading in that space. I've got another book here, for newly married couples, Sex Awakened by Renee Yam. That just came out recently.
So Cultivating Healthy Sexual Intimacy in Marriage, Renee Yam.
Yeah, that's just for newly married couples, a very basic overview so there's kind of referring on, there's a great book by Emily Nagoski called come as you are, not by a Christian, but really fantastic and helpful for women understanding their own bodies. So framing, like a healthy framework of understanding.
So as you talk about shame, and particularly premarital couples, I'm thinking that a number of the conversations I've ended up having have been, I mean, we've had a lot of people converted as young adults, and so having been saved at young adults, they've had extensive sexual experience, they've stopped having sexual activity as they've come to Christ, and now they're about to get married. And some of that sexual activity has been with heterosexual partners, some of it's been sometimes with homosexual partners, but now we're preparing them for heterosexual marriage. And that's a conversation now of kind of my messy past that's on the table. And give me some advice.
So as I was saying, this name, frame, then claim. I think this is the claim part. So for me, claiming is like claiming your body, and I do somatic work with that. But I think for ministers, the claim part is claiming God's vision of sexuality for them to understand how that fits for them. You know, and were you going to say something?
No.
And I guess the final one is aim. What is their new legacy? What is their new story? What are the new values what are the values that they want to take from their past into the current space? And are there any values that they don't think was working for them or is not biblically aligned, but they were just told? You know, so it's about forming a new story with their partner, but not ignoring their old story or not ignoring their past, but using what they've learned from the past to pay forward a hopeful future for them. So, and that's important, that aim part, the new legacy that they're about to make, is an important part of that journey. So that's what I would say in terms of how do you help people with shame. It's about almost taking them through that, you know, helping them tell their story, helping them to get the information they need.
And tell their story to their new partner, to their fiancé, to confess and apologise. And
and if that and encouraging the fiancé to be that safe space, to hold that container. So that they can see that they're not going to receive rejection, they're not going to receive judgment, but that they can hold that container for their partner and just listen.
And offer forgiveness.
And offer forgiveness,
Women and porn, how do you speak into that space? We've spent a lot of time on the Pastor's Heart talking about men and porn, and I just thought, while I've got you, I'll throw that question at you.
Well, look, men and women both look at porn, you know, and the stats are particularly now going up, you know, accessibility's there, and it doesn't make it any less of a problem for, you know, women. It's still an issue, and I think probably the bigger issue here is shame for women, because it's not spoken about as much as it is for men. So they have that extra layer of shame that they bring with them when they're talking about, or when they're confessing to somebody about their problem with porn, or they're addicted to porn, or whatever it might be. So I guess it's important, particularly important for women, that space is held, you know, for them. And then I think, as I was talking about before, it's part of the journey is understanding, well, what is their underlying need, what's going on for them that is leading them to needing this in their life. And so it actually means leaning into the addiction, or leaning into what they're doing, not putting a immediate stop and not telling them just to kind of run away, because actually there's something about what's happening in that space that is leading them to that. And sometimes even a helpful question is, you know, what would you lose if we took this away? Actually, you know, what would you miss in your life? Because it's obviously filling a need. And could we fill that need with God in some way, or community? Or, you know, what is that you're actually turning to porn for? And, you know, how can we reconnect you with God, and how can he fill that? So do you need validation from God? You know, the healing of the shame once they feel seen by God and understood. And, you know, there's a lot of healing that can happen as they understand how they're seen before God as a child of God. And I think that's where a lot of the healing happens. And then, of course, there's referring on to somebody like a therapist that could work with helping them. Because what's often happened is the neural pathway is formed along a particular way. So then within therapy, there needs to be a space to help them understand, firstly, the differences between porn and real life, and secondly, how do they actually experience pleasure in their bodies, so that we can start to redirect their desire in a healthy way with their partners if they're with a partner, so that can be a far more enjoyable experience than the porn experience, and then starts to they're on a different neural pathway that is being continually strengthened as they're enjoying their sex with somebody that is far more meaningful, and also while that need is being met in other ways that they're turning but that's the same for men too. That's kind of the work that we do with men as well, so it's not too big a difference there. But I just think being really delicate and gentle with women, because there is an added level of shame and layer of shame for them because it's not spoken about, is really important. Yeah. Does that?
Yeah. Talk to me about questions that I and others as senior pastors can ask when we're wanting to touch base with couples and just to explore how they're going. I'm just thinking, last night, on Sunday night at church, I said to a bride of a few months, so how are you surviving married life? Do you know? And which was kind of giving her the space to not have to pretend it was all roses if it wasn't roses. And she said, thanks for asking that. Now, how do I do that in the area of sex, or is it appropriate for me to do that in terms of touching base with how are people moving in that direction?
I think that's a great question. I think that the issue is really always, what is the motivation of your asking? What do you want from that conversation? And it comes down to the pastor's heart, I guess, as he's asking that question. Is the motivation to kind of get the juicy details?
Well, the motivation is not voyeuristic.
Obviously not for you. Right, exactly.
The motivation is just recognising if that area is not going wrong, and we're not nipping this. Sorry, if that area is not going right, and we're not moving to work out how to help that area, then in the end we've got bigger problems down the track. And so I've found often, and I'm very willing to be corrected, but I found often that how things are going sexually is often a litmus test or a barometer for how things are going in the rest of the relationship. And often it's a really helpful diagnostic question for is the whole relationship in trouble or not? But so I'm just trying to really work out how to ask that litmus test question well.
Yes. And I mean, it could go the other way too.
That's my pastor's heart.
No, perfect. And that's great. And I think just being aware of that, but also communicating that is important. Not keeping that to yourself and saying, I really care about, I care about marriage and I love happy relationships. And I've the stats say that in the first year of marriage, things are tough. So I just wanted to check in and see, how you guys are going. But then, what you were saying is the litmus test idea that sometimes it's a litmus test for how the rest of the relationship can go. It can be the other way.
I mean, I'm just going from my own anecdotal conversations with people, but would you agree with that?
It can be the other way too. It can be that the fact that the sex isn't working is also impacting on all their other relationships. So it's hard to know what comes first.
Right.
Is the relationship an issue and therefore they're not having sex? Or is there's something happening in the sexual space that's meaning their relationship isn't going so well because there's that pressure of
But would you agree with the correlation? I mean, you were discussing which one was causing the other, but would you say that there is a correlation there?
Yes, most definitely, And so, I guess you can get to that either way. You can, go straight in and ask, how's the intimacy? Or even for me, a really good question to ask is, have you guys faced any differences of opinion in that space? Do you have any different opinions? Have you found that you don't agree on areas within this space? And that will often open up good conversation if they're struggling.
That's a really good question because it's not quite as in the core of what's going on. It's more talking about how are your conversations going.
Exactly,
Yeah, I
and
like
how are
that.
you talking about that?
Yeah.
You know, and that's literally how you can frame it too. Is how are you talking about that, and you know, how can we support you, or you know, those sort of things. And also, I guess, affirming the fact that it's completely normal to have these issues, and you know, that there's help, and so you know, to kind of always. But I think part of it is putting out straight out off the bat that your motives out there and asking that question. That always helps people understand the frame of your question, and then giving them open-ended questions for them to take that, you know, where they want. And I guess also, if you are in a conversation about sex with someone, I always say, if I ask a question that you don't want to answer, feel free to say pass. You know, and that gives them then the autonomy. You can go play all sorts of places. You can ask the question, but you've already said right up front that there is no pressure on you to feel like you have to answer it if you don't want to. And that also puts people at ease, knowing that they've got an easy pass and they're not squirming under the question of the minister. So that's good to also throw in there.
My guest on the Pastor's Heart, Monica Cook. She's a Christian, she's a sexologist, and it's been good for us to listen and learn from her on what she wishes senior pastors knew about sex. Looking forward to your company next week on the Pastor's Heart.